Hello everyone, this is Professor Sidebottom. In this video, we will talk about the subjunctive with conjunctions in Spanish. Let's start with a short review of the subjunctive. In order to form the subjunctive, we take the yo form of the indicative present, like yo hablo, yo corro, yo salgo. Then we remove the o from the end of the yo form of the verb, and we are left with the stem, yo hablo, yo corro, yo salgo. And finally, we add the opposite ending to the stem of the verb, and the final form is the subjunctive present, like yo hable, yo corra, yo salga. So the present subjunctive endings for AR verbs are es, hemos, eis, en. And the present subjunctive endings for ER and IR verbs are a, as, a, amos, ais, an. For more detailed information about how to form the subjunctive, please see my video called The Present Subjunctive in Spanish. Now let's talk about the subjunctive with conjunctions other than que. Conjunctions are words or expressions that connect sentences or other words. Unlike in our previous videos, in this lesson, we will use the subjunctive with conjunctions other than que by itself. The conjunctions that trigger the subjunctive are divided into two groups. Group number one, conjunctions that always trigger the subjunctive in the subordinate clause, because we will still have a main clause and a subordinate clause. And group number two, conjunctions that occasionally trigger the subjunctive in the subordinate clause. When we use the conjunctions that trigger occasionally the subjunctive, we do not concentrate anymore on the meaning of the verb in the main clause like we did until now, but rather on the tense of the said verb. And here are two examples. The first example is with a verb of emotion. Ella espera que su amiga saque una buena nota en el examen. She hopes that her friend will get a good grade on the exam. In this example, the verb espera, because it's a verb of emotion, triggers the subjunctive in the subordinate clause. However, let's look at the second example. Ella no va a ir al parque mañana a menos que haga sol. She's not going to go to the park tomorrow unless it's sunny. Here we don't have a verb of emotion or doubt, disbelief, denial in the first statement. It's just a regular verb, the verb ir. What triggers the subjunctive in the subordinate clause here is the conjunction a menos que. First, let's start with the conjunctions that always trigger the subjunctive. Para que, a fin de que, so that. A menos que, salvo que, a no ser que, unless. Antes de que, before. Con tal de que, provided that. Sin que, without. En caso de que, in case that. Notice that when para, sin, antes de, con tal de, después de are used without the word que, they trigger the infinitive instead of the subjunctive. And here are some examples. Yo estudio para graduarme. Yo estudio a fin de mejorar mi español. Ella salió del cuarto sin decir nada. Antes de irse, ella comió un sándwich. Después de volver, habló conmigo. Here are some examples with conjunctions that always trigger the subjunctive. Ellos tienen que practicar mucho a fin de que su español mejore. Vamos al zoológico para que observemos los animales. Vamos a ir de excursión a menos que haga mal tiempo. Vamos a preparar la cena antes de que los niños regresen a casa. Voy a comprar los alimentos con tal de que prepares la comida. Nada sucede en esa casa sin que ella lo sepa. Voy a traer unos guantes en caso de que haga frío. Iré al parque con tal de que vengas conmigo. Next, let's see the list of conjunctions that occasionally trigger the subjunctive. Cuando, when, apenas, en cuanto, or tan pronto como, as soon as, aunque, a pesar de que, aun cuando, even though, después de que, after, mientras, with the meaning provided that, as long as, hasta que, until. As I've mentioned before, when we use the conjunctions that occasionally trigger the subjunctive, we do not concentrate anymore on the meaning of the verb in the main clause. For example, if it's a verb of emotion or a verb of doubt, disbelief, denial, but rather on the tense of the said verb. If the verb in the main clause is in the future tense or in the form of a command, these conjunctions trigger the subjunctive. This is because the future, anything that has not happened yet, is seen as an uncertainty, as well as the commands because we do not know if they will be fulfilled. And here are two examples. Ella me va a llamar cuando pueda. She's going to call me when she can. Cuando triggers subjunctive here because I don't know when she can call me. I don't know when she will call. Or using a command, llámame cuando puedas. Call me when you can. Again, I don't know when you can call me, and I don't know when you're going to call. That's why we use the subjunctive. Now, if the verb in the main clause is in the past tense or expresses an action that habitually happens, these conjunctions trigger the indicative. This is because the past already happened, so it is seen as a fact, not as an uncertainty. Same thing with habitual actions because they're predictable. And here are two examples. Ella me llamó cuando pudo. She called me when she could. It already happened, so it's a fact. Ella siempre me llama cuando puede. She always calls me when she can. This is a habitual action because she always calls me, so it is predictable. Here we have some examples with conjunctions that occasionally trigger the subjunctive. In these examples, we have the future tense in the main clause, which triggers the subjunctive in the subordinate clause. Ella me va a llamar en cuanto pueda. Ana vendrá a tu fiesta de cumpleaños aunque esté cansada. Víctor va a hablar con el profesor después de que termine la conferencia. Nadie le va a escuchar mientras él no diga la verdad. Los pájaros no volverán hasta que el tiempo mejore. In the next examples with conjunctions that occasionally trigger the subjunctive, we have a past tense in the main clause which triggers the indicative, a tense of the indicative in the subordinate clause. Ella me llamó en cuanto pudo. Ana vino a tu fiesta de cumpleaños aunque estaba cansada. Víctor habló con el profesor después de que la conferencia terminó. Ángel tocaba el piano mientras su esposa leía un libro. Los pájaros no volvieron hasta que el tiempo mejoró. And then we have two statements where we have present tense in the main clause, which represents a habitual action, and then we have indicative in the subordinate clause. Los pájaros siempre vuelven cuando el tiempo mejora, or los pájaros siempre vuelven tan pronto como el tiempo mejora. As I've said before, if there is a past tense in the main clause or a present tense that represents a habitual action, then the indicative is triggered because everything is considered a fact. So in a nutshell, we have two groups of conjunctions. Conjunctions that can trigger the subjunctive or the indicative. The subjunctive when there is a future tense or a command in the main clause, and they trigger the indicative when there is past tense or a habitual action present tense in the main clause. These are cuando, apenas, en cuanto, tan pronto como, aunque, a pesar de que, aun cuando, después de que, mientras, hasta que. And then we have the conjunctions that always trigger the subjunctive, para que, a fin de que, a menos de que, salvo que, a no ser que, antes de que, con tal de que, sin que, en caso de que. Always students tell me that they have trouble remembering which ones are the ones that trigger subjunctive or indicative and which ones trigger subjunctive only. So I advise that you first make a list with the conjunctions that can trigger the subjunctive or the indicative and practice those first. And once you know them very well, then you go to the ones that trigger just the subjunctive, as it is easier to practice the ones that trigger just the subjunctive. Thank you for your attention. I hope this video helps you understand better the subjunctive with conjunctions. Hasta la próxima.